A daily life in an ancient Roman city. A complete journey through time. Welcome to an extraordinary journey back 2,000 years, to a time when the Roman Empire stretched across 3 continents and daily life pulsed through cities of stone and marble. Imagine standing at dawn in a Mediterranean city, watching pale sunlight reflect off ancient streets as the first stirrings of life begin around you. Archaeological excavations, especially in places like Pompeii, have given us an exceptional window into daily Roman life. When Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79 AD, it buried Pompeii suddenly, preserving the city like a time capsule and creating an unparalleled record of life in the Roman Empire. Through pottery fragments, painted walls, and remarkably preserved ruins, we can rediscover how ordinary people lived, worked, loved, and died in ancient times. Over the next hours, we'll follow the rhythms of a typical Roman day, from dawn's first light to the peaceful hush of night. We'll blend history and archaeology into a soothing journey through time, exploring the streets, homes, markets, and public spaces that defined Roman urban life. We'll meet the people who inhabited these cities, from wealthy patricians in their grand homes to humble workers in cramped apartments, from children learning their letters to gladiators fighting in the arena. This is not just a story of emperors and conquests. This is the story of everyday Romans, how they fetched water at dawn, what they ate for breakfast, where they worked, how they worshipped their gods, and what they did for entertainment. It's a story preserved in the archaeological record and waiting to be told. So let us step back through the centuries together and experience a day in the life of an ancient Roman city. Dawn in the Roman city. Before the sun crests the horizon, the Roman city begins to awaken. Without electric light to extend the day, people rose very early, often at the first hour of daylight. One schedule preserved in Pompeii calls this ora prima diurna, the very first hour of day. The first task of the morning for most Romans was fetching water. Since few private taps existed in ancient cities, the majority of Romans went to public fountains or cisterns to fill their clay jars and amphorae. These public fountains were scattered throughout the city at regular intervals, ensuring that no household was too far from a water source. Women, children, and sometimes male household slaves would make this daily pilgrimage, carrying heavy vessels on their shoulders or balancing them on their heads. For those who could afford it, a visit to the public baths before work was a popular way to start the day. They would use the heated pools and steam rooms not only to wash, but also to warm up in the cool morning air, to exercise, and to socialize with neighbors and friends. The baths opened early to accommodate those who had to be at work by mid-morning. Breakfast in a Roman household was simple and quick. Most people ate bread with cheese or olives, perhaps accompanied by a cup of wine diluted with water. Wine was considered safer to drink than plain water in many areas, and even children drank it when properly watered down. Some households might add honey to their bread or enjoy fresh fruit if it was in season. The meal was designed to provide energy without taking much time away from the day's work. As dawn brightened into morning, the streets slowly came alive with activity. Bakers opened their small bakery shops, the tantalizing aroma of fresh bread wafting through the narrow streets. These pistrina, as they were called, featured large stone ovens that had been heating since before dawn. The bakers hawked their fragrant loaves to early customers, circular flatbreads, sometimes stamped with the baker's mark. Barbers set up their simple stools outside their shops, ready to shave and trim the beards of male customers. The barber shop served as more than just a place for grooming. It was a quiet meeting place where men gathered to exchange news, discuss politics, and share gossip. A barber might spend as much time listening to his customers' stories as he did wielding his razor. People began to greet each other in the forum or along the narrow alleyways. Salve, they would call out, the standard Roman greeting. Neighbors exchanged pleasantries, asked about each other's families, and shared news from the previous day. The Roman city was a tight-knit community where most people knew their neighbors by name. Markets were quiet at first, but soon merchants and vendors began to arrive, laying out fruits, vegetables, pottery, cloth, and countless other goods on their stalls and tables. The city's pulse quickened with the arrival of the first commuters, soldiers heading to their barracks, laborers walking to construction sites, and children making their way to whatever schooling might await them. By mid-morning, the city was fully stirring. The noise of wooden cartwheels rumbling over stone streets mixed with the chatter of early customers and the rhythmic ring of the blacksmith's hammer striking hot iron. Street vendors called out their wares in loud voices, competing for attention. Dogs barked, children laughed and shouted, and the gentle bustle of urban life created a symphony of human activity that would continue throughout the day. The morning air might carry the scent of fresh bread, roasting meat, incense from a nearby temple, and the less pleasant odors of the street drains. The rising sun cast long shadows across the stone-paved streets, and the city prepared itself for another day of commerce, work, worship, and community life. This was the Roman morning, a time of purposeful activity, of routines established over centuries, of a civilization confident in its systems and its future. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the full life of the city would unfold in all its complexity and wonder. Homes and domestic life. Roman homes varied dramatically depending on one's wealth and social status, but every home, whether grand or humble, was a place of life, family, and community. Understanding these domestic spaces helps us comprehend how Romans truly lived day to day. The wealthiest families lived in structures called domus, substantial city houses that could occupy an entire city block. A typical domus had a specific architectural layout that had evolved over centuries. Visitors entered through a narrow corridor that opened suddenly into a central atrium, a large room open to the sky. This atrium was the heart of the home's public life and the most impressive space designed to awe guests. In the center of the atrium floor was the Impluvium, a shallow rectangular basin that collected rainwater falling through the opening in the roof above. The collected water could be used for household needs or simply provided a reflecting pool that added beauty and coolness to the space. The atrium was where the pater familias, the male head of the household, received his clients and guests each morning in a daily ritual called the Salutatio. The atrium also typically housed the family lararium, a small shrine to the household spirits and gods. This sacred space was fundamental to Roman domestic religion and was tended daily by family members. Surrounding the atrium were various rooms, cubicula or bedrooms where family members slept, the triclinium or dining room where meals were taken while reclining on couches, and the tablinum, which served as the pater familias's office and reception room for important business. Behind the front portion of the house lay the peristyle, a shaded garden courtyard surrounded by columns. This private outdoor space often featured fountains, flowering plants, herbs, and even small trees, providing a peaceful retreat from the city's noise and heat. Wealthy families took pride in their peristyle gardens, which might include marble statuary, mosaic pathways, and elaborate water features. The walls of a domus were frequently decorated with colorful frescoes depicting mythological scenes, landscapes, or architectural illusions that made rooms appear larger. Floors were often laid with intricate mosaics, some so detailed and beautiful that they are considered works of art today. The home showcased the family's status and wealth at every turn. Guests might see ancestral death masks displayed in wooden cabinets, symbols of the family's long history and distinguished lineage. Oil lamps burned before the household Lares, the protective spirits of the home, maintaining the connection between the living and the divine. However, this luxurious lifestyle was available to only a tiny fraction of the urban population. In stark contrast to the spacious domus, the vast majority of city dwellers lived in insulae, multi-story apartment buildings that dominated the urban landscape. These insulae could rise 4 to 6 stories high, packed with tiny flats that housed the working poor and middle class. In the port town of Ostia, archaeological evidence suggests that 90 to 95% of the population lived in insulae rather than private homes. This statistic likely held true for Rome and other major cities as well. The insulae were the ancient equivalent of modern apartment complexes, but with far less regulation and safety. Within an insula, there was a clear hierarchy. The wealthiest renters occupied the lower floors, which offered easier access to the street, better ventilation, and were safer in case of fire or collapse. These ground floor and first floor apartments might have multiple rooms, running water from the aqueduct system, and even small balconies. As you climbed higher, conditions deteriorated. The very poorest residents were cramped into dark, airless cells on the top floors, reached by several flights of steep, narrow stairs. These upper apartments were oppressively hot in summer and freezing in winter. They often lacked running water, forcing residents to carry every drop up multiple flights of stairs. Toilet facilities were minimal or non-existent at the upper levels, requiring residents to use chamber pots or descend to public latrines. Privacy was virtually non-existent in these tiny spaces, where entire families might share a single small room. The construction of insulae was often hasty and cheap, driven by profit-seeking landlords. Builders used wood and cheaper materials in the upper stories to reduce costs, making these structures dangerously unstable. Some insulae collapsed in storms or earthquakes, crushing their inhabitants. Fires were an even more constant threat, as cooking fires and oil lamps could easily ignite the wooden construction, and flames spread rapidly through the connected buildings. The danger was so severe that emperors eventually imposed legal limits on the height of insulae to reduce the risk of collapse. By midday, if you walked through Rome's narrow lanes between insulae, you would hear the sounds of daily life filtering down from tiny windows above. Children's voices echoed as they played or did chores. The smell of cooking wafted from wood-fired stoves in lower apartments, while upper-floor residents might be preparing simpler cold meals. Laundry hung from windows and balconies to dry in the Mediterranean sun. Arguments between neighbors, crying babies, and the general noise of densely packed humanity created a constant urban soundtrack. Inside every home, whether domus or insula, family life took root and flourished. Family was the fundamental unit of Roman society, and the household extended beyond just blood relatives. Even though Roman women had limited political rights and could not vote or hold office, wives, known as matronae, had important and respected roles managing the household and raising children. In a wealthy domus, the matrona oversaw numerous slaves and servants, supervised meal preparations, managed the household budget and accounts, and ensured the smooth operation of a complex domestic machine. She was expected to be a model of virtue, modesty, and efficiency. Her domain was the household, and within that sphere, she wielded considerable authority. She might spend her mornings directing slaves in their tasks, inspecting stores of grain and oil, planning menus for upcoming dinners or social events, and tending to her children's education and moral development. In an insula apartment, life was far more hands-on for the woman of the house. Without servants, she might wash clothes by hand in a communal area or at a nearby fountain, fetch water at dawn carrying heavy jugs, prepare simple meals over a small brazier, and care for children in cramped quarters. Despite the differences in wealth and comfort, women at all social levels were the managers of daily domestic life. Children of any household lived under the absolute authority of the pater familias, their father or grandfather, until they married or he passed away. This legal authority, called patria potesta, gave the father tremendous power over his children's lives, including whom they could marry and what careers they could pursue. However, in practice, most Roman fathers exercised this power with affection and care, wanting the best for their offspring. A family meal in the evening was a sacred time of daily bonding. Even in the poorest households, families tried to eat together when possible. Candles or oil lamps flickered on low tables, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Stories were told by grandparents to younger children, passing down family history and moral lessons. Prayers might be offered to the household gods. The day's events were discussed, plans were made for tomorrow, and the bonds of family were renewed. Most Romans, from patrician to plebeian, lived quite simply by modern standards, even in wealthy homes. They slept on simple wooden beds, though wealthy families might have comfortable mattresses and pillows. They wore wool or linen tunics most of the time, with togas reserved for public occasions. They cherished small comforts, a soft pillow, a cup of good wine after a long day, a moment of quiet in the garden, a loving spouse, healthy children. Even in the grand Domus, one could sense the hum of day-to-day tasks that kept the household running. Someone was always sweeping the Atrium floor, cleaning the Impluvium, grinding grain for porridge, tending the fire, preparing food, or caring for children. The household shrine received daily attention, with fresh flowers, incense, and small offerings for the Lares and Penates, the protective spirits of home and pantry. These domestic deities were fundamental to Roman household religion, believed to protect the family from harm and ensure prosperity. The home, whether wealthy or poor, large or small, was the center of Roman life. It was where children were born and the elderly died, where meals were shared and arguments settled, where religion was practiced and love was made. It was the foundation upon which all of Roman society rested. Understanding Roman domestic life helps us see these ancient people not as distant historical figures, but as human beings much like ourselves, seeking safety, comfort, and happiness within the walls of home. Food and dining, the daily bread. Food grounded daily life in ancient Rome. It was a constant concern, a daily pleasure, and for many, a struggle. Understanding what Romans ate and how they ate it gives us intimate insight into their daily existence. Bread was the absolute staple of every Roman table, from the poorest laborer to the wealthiest senator. These flat loaves were made from wheat or the older grain called emmer flour, often baked in large communal ovens. The bread was typically dense and chewy, quite different from modern varieties. It was often dipped in wine or olive oil to add flavor and moisture. The Roman state recognized bread's fundamental importance and distributed a grain dole to citizens in Rome, ensuring that even the poor had access to this basic necessity. In Pompeii and other cities throughout the empire, one could find pistrina, combination mills and bakeries, where large stone mills ground grain into flour and big ovens turned out hundreds of loaves daily. These bakeries were essential businesses, and bakers were respected members of the community. Some of the bread was marked with stamps showing which bakery it came from, an early form of branding. Alongside bread, the common diet included olives and olive oil, which were fundamental to Mediterranean cuisine. Cheese made from sheep's or goat's milk was eaten regularly. Legumes like lentils, chickpeas, and fava beans provided protein and variety. Romans also enjoyed abundant fruits and vegetables. They planted and cultivated an impressive variety of crops, including 10 different varieties of lettuce, turnips, onions, leeks, cabbage, beets, and numerous others. Fish was eaten especially by those living near the sea or by wealthier families who could afford to have it transported inland. Fresh fish from the Mediterranean, dried fish from the provinces, and preserved fish were all consumed. Lamb and pork were served more regularly at elite tables, while the poor might eat meat only on special occasions or festivals. Chickens and eggs were more commonly available to people of moderate means. One condiment defined Roman cuisine above all others: garum. This was a fermented fish sauce made by salting fish and fish parts and allowing them to break down in the sun over several months. The resulting liquid was strained and sold throughout the empire. Garum was famously shipped from production centers in Mauritania and Thrace to Roman markets everywhere. It added a salty, umami-rich flavor to many dishes, much as soy sauce does in Asian cuisine today. Romans used it on vegetables, in stews, and as a table condiment. Different grades of garum existed, from premium varieties for the wealthy to cheaper versions for common people. Roman meals were structured by the sun's movement across the sky. The day's first meal, Antaculum, was a light breakfast taken at dawn. It might consist of bread, fruit, cheese, or honey, often accompanied by watered-down wine. This meal was meant to be quick and simple, just enough to give energy for the morning's work. Around midday, workers and students took Prandium, a modest lunch that provided quick energy, so laborers could continue their work through the afternoon. This might be more bread, some cold meat left over from the previous night's dinner, cheese, olives, or whatever was readily available. It was often eaten quickly, standing or sitting at a street stall rather than at home. The main meal of the day was Cena, eaten in late afternoon or early evening when the day's work was done. Among the upper classes, Cena became an elaborate multi-course affair, almost a social ritual. It often began with gustatio, an appetizer course of vegetables, eggs, or shellfish designed to stimulate the appetite. The main course might feature meat, fish, or a grain porridge called pulse, accompanied with vegetables and bread. The meal concluded with secundae mensae, dessert consisting of fresh fruits, dried fruits, nuts, or simple pastries sweetened with honey. Wealthy hosts reclined on couches around three sides of a low table for these dinners, a dining arrangement called the triclinium, after the three couches. Dinner parties could stretch late into the night, accompanied by music, dancing, poetry readings, or philosophical discussions. Slaves served course after course while the diners ate, drank, conversed, and enjoyed entertainment. These events were important social occasions where business was discussed, political alliances were formed, and status was displayed. By contrast, common folk kept their dinners much simpler. A typical working family cena might be a pulse porridge mixed with vegetables for the poor, or perhaps grilled fish and olives for the middle class. In Pompeii, for instance, a typical evening meal might be the highlight of the day, a chance to finally relax after hours of work. People might discuss the day's news at the table or share stories by the flickering lamplight. After the main courses of dinner, wine usually followed. Romans drank wine at nearly every meal, but they rarely drank it straight. Instead, they mixed it with water, sometimes adding honey, herbs, or spices. They believed drinking unmixed wine was barbaric and led to drunkenness. Wine mixing became almost an art, with different ratios of wine to water suitable for different occasions and times of day. Despite the lack of cane sugar, which was unknown in ancient Rome, or butter, which they rarely used, Romans loved sweet foods and desserts. They sweetened dishes with honey, the only sweetener widely available. Fresh fruit platters were enjoyed: grapes, figs, apples, pears, and others, depending on the season. Dried fruits like dates were imported from warmer climates. Simple cakes and pastries sweetened with honey provided treats, though these were more common at wealthy tables. The decadence and variety of Roman dishes depended entirely on wealth. Exotic ingredients like imported figs from Syria, spiced dishes using pepper and cinnamon from the East, or elaborate preparations featuring multiple types of meat were luxuries of the rich. A wealthy Roman might dine on peacock, dormice fattened in special jars, or elaborate presentations designed more to impress than to nourish. Meanwhile, a poor family considered themselves fortunate to have bread, olive oil, some vegetables, and perhaps a bit of fish or cheese. Food permeated Roman culture in ways beyond mere nutrition. Dinner parties were crucial social events. What you could afford to eat showed your status. The ability to host impressive dinners demonstrated wealth and influence. Sharing food created social bonds. Offering food to the gods through sacrifice and offerings was a central religious act. In every way, food was central to what it meant to be Roman, connecting the practical necessities of survival with social customs, religious beliefs, and the pleasures of life. Work and occupations, the rhythm of labor. Once the breakfast embers died down and the morning washing was complete, the Roman city's work life began in earnest. A Roman's occupation usually reflected his social class and determined the rhythm of his daily existence. Most plebeians, the common citizens who formed the majority of the urban population, worked in trades or on farms. Farmers outside the city walls tilled the fields, growing wheat in vast quantities, tending vineyards for wine production, and cultivating olive groves. The agricultural surplus these farmers produced fed the cities and formed the foundation of the Roman economy. Inside the city walls, artisans and craftsmen were at their forges and workshops by morning. Potters shaped amphorae and household vessels on their wheels, their hands covered in wet clay. Smiths hammered iron tools and weapons, the sound of metal on metal ringing through the streets. Cobblers mended sandals and made new footwear, essential in a walking city. Masons and builders set stones for roads, temples, and houses, continuing the endless construction that kept the cities growing. Merchants handled goods from every corner of the empire: wine from Gaul, olive oil from Hispania, spices from the distant east, purple dye from Phoenicia, glassware from Syria. These goods moved through markets and docks, creating a complex web of commerce that connected the Roman world. Even city dwellers living in cramped insulae apartments often ran small shops called tabernae on the ground floor of their buildings: a baker, a butcher, a cloth merchant, a wine cellar. Salesmen and shopkeepers displayed their wares in open shops facing the street, with wide doorways and no glass windows. Customers and passers-by could browse and bargain directly from the street, creating a constant flow of commercial activity. Prices were negotiated rather than fixed, and skilled bargaining was an essential skill for both merchant and customer. The economic economy was remarkably bustling and diverse. Farmers produced wheat, olives, grapes, and livestock on farms large and small. Merchants traded goods like wine, oil, textiles, and spices across the vast Mediterranean. Craftsmen created pottery, weapons, jewelry, and countless household items, each specialist perfecting his particular skill over years of practice. Traders from foreign lands mingled in ports like Ostia, Rome's harbor city. Ostia's busy waterfront was constantly loaded with amphora of olive oil, sacks of grain, barrels of wine, and countless other goods destined for Rome's million inhabitants. The labor of moving these goods from ship to warehouse to wagon kept many people employed all day. Stevedores unloaded ships, warehouse workers cataloged and stored goods, and guards protected valuable merchandise from theft. Slaves comprised a significant portion of the workforce, perhaps a third or more of the population in cities. These people, though legally considered property rather than persons, were integral to society and performed tasks ranging from skilled to brutal. Slaves might handle household chores, cooking, cleaning, childcare, and serving their owners. Others had specialized skills. Some were teachers, doctors, accountants, or craftsmen who worked independently and gave part of their earnings to their owners. Wealthy households relied heavily on slave labor. A rich family might own dozens or even hundreds of slaves, each with specific duties. Some slaves even ran their own workshops or businesses as agents for their owners, and successful slaves might eventually purchase their freedom, becoming freedmen. However, far from the comfortable urban households, many slaves toiled under harsh conditions. In the mines and quarries, slaves dug for silver, gold, copper, and marble under brutal supervision. On large agricultural estates called latifundia, slave gangs worked the fields in chains. These slaves lived short, hard lives with little hope of freedom. Freedmen, former slaves who had been emancipated through purchase, reward, or their owner's will, formed a growing and important middle group in Roman society. Though technically free, freedmen lacked some civic rights that freeborn Romans enjoyed. They could not hold high political office, though their children, born after emancipation, would be full citizens. Many freedmen became traders, artisans, or clerks, and some became quite wealthy through business success, though they never fully escaped the stigma of their former slavery. Soldiers filled another important category of Roman workers. Young Roman men, particularly from the lower classes, might sign up for service in the legions. A soldier's daily life was highly regimented, drilling at dawn to maintain combat skills, marching to build endurance, constructing camps and fortifications, and performing sentry duty. Discipline was strict, and punishment for infractions could be severe. But legion service offered real benefits. Soldiers were paid regular wages, fed well, and received land grants upon retirement after 25 years of service. According to historical sources, by the 4th century, most legionaries ate as well as anyone in Rome, supplied with bread, meat, and vegetables wherever they were stationed. The legions were not just military forces, but also engineering corps, building roads, aqueducts, and fortifications throughout the empire. By late afternoon, after 8 or more hours of labor, city workers would leave their shops and workshops. They washed off the dust and sweat of the day in the public baths or at home and rejoined their families for the evening meal. The workday ended naturally with the failing light, as oil lamps were expensive and work after dark was difficult. The rhythm of work structured Roman life. Your occupation determined when you woke, how you spent your day, whom you interacted with, and your place in society. Work was not just about earning money, but about identity, community, and contributing to the complex machine that kept Roman civilization functioning. From the humblest street sweeper to the wealthy merchant, from the slave in the mines to the soldier on the frontier, each person's labor was a thread in the vast tapestry of Roman economic life. Education and childhood, growing up Roman. Childhood in ancient Rome was shaped by family, wealth, and social expectations. Roman children experienced a world both familiar and foreign to modern eyes, where affection mixed with strictness, and where education ranged from non-existent to sophisticated. From the moment of birth, Roman children were under the absolute authority of the pater familias, the male head of the family. This legal power, called patria potestas, gave the father rights over his children that seem shocking today. In the earliest periods, a father could even choose whether to accept a newborn into the family or reject it. By the imperial period, such practices had softened, but the principle of paternal authority remained strong throughout a child's life. Despite this formal authority, most Roman parents loved their children deeply. We find touching epitaphs on children's graves, expressions of grief over young deaths, and references in letters to parental pride and affection. Mothers especially were expected to bond closely with their children, nursing them and caring for them in infancy. From infancy through early childhood, Roman children learned from their parents and household. Mothers taught songs, prayers, and customs to both sons and daughters. They transmitted religious practices, moral values, and proper behavior. In wealthy households, educated slaves, often Greeks who had been captured in war, served as tutors and pedagogues, teaching basic skills at home. Young Roman children played much as children do today, though with simpler toys. They had wooden dolls, hoops that they rolled through the streets with sticks, balls made of leather or cloth, and board games. In the courtyard of a domus, children might chase each other, play hide-and-seek, or invent imaginary games. Even in cramped insula apartments, children found ways to play in the streets and alleyways when weather permitted. By around age 7, considered the age of reason, many children began formal education. However, education was not universal or mandatory. What schooling a child received depended entirely on family wealth and ambition. For poor families, children might receive no formal education at all, instead learning their parents' trade through apprenticeship. For average and middling families, elementary education took place at the ludus literarius, a primary school. A local teacher, called a literator or magister, would gather a handful of students, often in a public space like a colonnade or in a small rented room, to learn the fundamentals. These were not grand school buildings, but modest arrangements, with the teacher sitting on a chair and students on simple benches. Pupils brought wax tablets and a stylus, an ancient form of reusable paper. They would practice writing letters and words, scratching them into the wax with the pointed stylus, then smoothing the wax to try again. Their first lessons were simple: tracing wooden letter forms to learn the alphabet, memorizing moral sayings and simple phrases, and learning to count using small pebbles or a simple abacus. The school day began early, often at dawn, and continued for several hours. There were no summers off, though market days and numerous religious festivals provided breaks. Discipline could be harsh. Teachers might strike students with a rod or strap for misbehavior or poor performance. The atmosphere was probably noisy and chaotic, with students of various ages all studying different lessons in the same room. By around age 10 or 11, wealthier boys and occasionally privileged girls might advance to study with a Grammaticus, a grammar school teacher. Here, the curriculum became more sophisticated. Students learned Greek alongside Latin, read and analyzed poetry, especially Homer and Virgil, and studied grammar, rhetoric, and literature. They memorized long passages, learned to write poetry in proper meters, and discussed the meaning of classical texts. A select few of the richest families continued their sons' education with a rhetor, a teacher of rhetoric and philosophy. These students, in their teenage years, learned public speaking, law, and philosophical reasoning. They practiced composing and delivering speeches, studied legal cases, and engaged in debates. This advanced education prepared young men for public life, for careers in law, politics, or administration. However, girls faced a very different educational path. While some privileged girls learned to read and write and might receive instruction in Greek, literature, and music, their education typically ended by their early teens. The curriculum for girls focused heavily on domestic skills, spinning wool, weaving cloth, cooking, and managing a household. Mothers and female tutors taught daughters these essential skills at home. The reasoning was practical. Girls typically married in their early to mid-teens, and their primary role in society was to manage a household and raise children. Reading and writing were useful skills for managing household accounts and corresponding with family, but advanced rhetoric and philosophy were considered unnecessary and even inappropriate for women. Roman parents, regardless of class, valued literacy and numeracy. Even modest families tried to teach children basic reading and arithmetic, skills necessary for business and daily life. As one source notes, Roman education aimed to teach citizens how to count, weigh, and measure for market life. A shopkeeper's son needed to calculate prices, record transactions, and read contracts, even if he never studied Virgil. By late afternoon, children returned home from school or from helping with family work. They might spend time playing board games like Lathrunculi, a complex strategy game similar to checkers, in the shady atrium or courtyard before dinner. Roman children also played with knuckle bones, using small bones as dice for games of chance. Despite limited opportunities compared to modern children, Roman children of all classes experienced love, play, learning, and growth. They lived under the close supervision of their familia, the extended household, where aunts, uncles, grandparents, and older siblings all played roles in raising the young. They learned from observation and participation, watching their mother spin wool, helping their father in the shop, accompanying adults to religious rituals and public events. The puer and puella, boy and girl, were respected as future citizens and household members, though they occupied a subordinate position until adulthood. Childhood in Rome was shorter than today, with responsibilities and adulthood arriving earlier, but it still held moments of wonder, learning, and the gradual transformation from child to citizen. Religion and rituals, the sacred in daily life. Religion was not a separate sphere of life in ancient Rome, practiced only on special occasions or in designated buildings. Rather, religion was woven into every moment, every action, and every space of Roman life. From private homes to public forums, from dawn prayers to evening libations, the divine permeated the everyday. In each Roman home, in the atrium or a specially designated area, stood a larium, a small household shrine. This sacred space housed statuettes or paintings of the household Lares and Penates, the guardian spirits fundamental to Roman domestic religion. The Lares were protective spirits of the home and family, while the Penates specifically guarded the pantry and ensured the household had food. Every morning, as dawn's pale light filled the atrium, Romans would perform small acts of worship at their larium. They might light incense or oil lamps before the shrine, the smoke carrying prayers upward. They would say short prayers for protection and prosperity, asking the household gods to guard the family through the coming day. They left small offerings, bread, wine, honey cakes, fruit, or even small toys, placed reverently before the statues. These rituals were performed routinely, not just on special occasions. Roman families gave regular thanks and offerings to household spirits, honoring these minor domestic deities and the spirits of past relatives daily. The lararium was tended primarily by the matron of the house, though all family members participated. Even children learned early to respect the household gods and to understand their importance to family welfare. This domestic religion was deeply personal and sincere. Romans believed that maintaining good relations with their household spirits was essential for the family's well-being. Neglecting the Lares could bring misfortune, illness, or financial problems. By these daily rituals, the home became a sacred space, and the family's routine activities were sanctified. Outside the home, the Roman cityscape was filled with temples and shrines. In the Forum Romanum, or the Forum of any provincial city, grand temples stood dedicated to the major gods of the Roman pantheon: Jupiter, king of the gods and patron of the Roman state; Juno, his wife and protector of women; Mars, god of war and father of Rome's legendary founders; Venus, goddess of love and divine ancestor of the Julian family, and many others. On street corners, in marketplaces, and at crossroads throughout the city, you would find smaller shrines to minor deities and local spirits. These might be simple niches in walls containing a small statue and a place for offerings, or more elaborate structures with columns and roofs. Passers-by might stop to leave a coin or say a quick prayer, seeking blessing for a journey or a business transaction. The Roman religious calendar was packed with festivals, market days, and holy days. Some scholars estimate that nearly half the days of the year had some religious significance. Major festivals brought the entire community together in celebration and worship. Saturnalia in December was perhaps the most famous, a carnival-like festival when social norms were relaxed or even reversed. Masters served slaves at dinner and gifts were exchanged. The Lupercalia in February honored fertility and purification. The Vestalia in June celebrated Vesta, goddess of the hearth. On these festival days and many others, priests and magistrates led public sacrifices. A pig, sheep, or poultry would be ritually slaughtered at a temple altar, its blood offered to the god, while priests examined the entrails for divine signs. The meat was then distributed to participants, or sold, so religious sacrifice also served as a form of public feast. Romans believed these acts secured divine favor for crops, businesses, military campaigns, and family welfare. Temples hosted these rituals regularly. Perhaps the most important was the Temple of Vesta in Rome's Forum, where the sacred fire of Rome burned continuously, tended by the Vestal Virgins, priestesses who dedicated 30 years of their lives to serving the goddess. This eternal flame symbolized Rome's existence. If it went out, disaster was thought to be imminent. Smaller temples to Vesta existed in other cities, each maintaining its own sacred fire. State religion coexisted harmoniously with personal piety. While the state organized grand public ceremonies, individuals maintained their private relationships with the gods. By evening, many worshippers would drop by small neighborhood shrines to make a libation, pouring a bit of wine on the ground while saying a prayer. They might light a lamp at a crossroad shrine or leave a small coin at a temple. In later imperial times, emperor worship became part of urban religion. People made offerings to the genius, or divine spirit, of the reigning emperor. They attended games and festivals held in the emperor's name. Temples were built to deified emperors after their deaths. However, this cult of the emperor was more political than spiritual, a way of showing loyalty to the state. At heart, ancient Romans understood religion as a transaction with the divine. Respect the gods through correct ritual, perform the proper sacrifices, maintain the sacred traditions, and in return, success and prosperity would follow. This transactional view was not cynical, but practical. The Romans were a practical people, and their religion reflected this. They adopted foreign gods readily if those deities seemed powerful or useful, incorporating them into their own pantheon. As one historical summary notes, Romans worshipped a pantheon of gods and goddesses, maintained both grand temples and simple household lauraria, and celebrated numerous festivals, including Saturnalia and Lupercalia, throughout the year. The religious life of Rome was rich, varied, and constant. In the quiet of twilight, one might imagine a typical Roman family gathered around their household larium. The father pours a libation of wine, the mother lights a lamp before the Lares, children watch and learn. They give thanks for the day's blessings, ask protection for the night, remember their ancestors, and reaffirm their connection to the divine powers that they believed governed all existence. This scene, repeated in countless homes across the empire every evening, demonstrates how even as life was ordinary, filled with work and meals and sleep, it was simultaneously steeped in reverence and sacred meaning. The Romans lived in a world populated by gods and spirits, where every action had religious significance and where the boundary between the sacred and the mundane was fluid and permeable. Entertainment and leisure, the Roman at play. Work may have structured Roman life, but Romans prized their leisure time intensely. Entertainment and social activities were not luxuries, but essential parts of what it meant to live well. From bathing to spectacles, from games to theater, Romans pursued pleasure with enthusiasm. The great public baths were perhaps the most important social institutions in any Roman city. These were not merely places for washing, but vibrant community centers where Romans of all classes gathered daily. A typical large bathhouse, like the Stabian baths in Pompeii or the Grand Imperial baths in Rome, offered a sophisticated suite of rooms designed for the bathing ritual. The bathing sequence typically began in the Apodyterium, the changing room, where bathers removed their clothing and stored it in niches, or left it with attendants. From there, they might proceed to exercise in the Palaestra, an open-air courtyard surrounded by colonnades. Here they could wrestle, lift weights, play ball games, or practice athletic skills. After exercise came the bath itself. Bathers moved through a sequence of rooms of increasing temperature. First was the tepidarium, a warm room that helped the body adjust. Then came the caldarium, the hot room with heated floors and walls, and a hot bath or pool, where bathers would sweat and steam. Some baths had a laconicum, an even hotter dry sauna. After the hot rooms, bathers would scrape off oil, sweat, and dirt with a curved metal tool called a strigil, as Romans did not have soap. Finally, they plunged into the frigidarium, the cold bath, which closed the pores and invigorated the body. But the baths offered far more than just washing. As one historian marvels, a Roman bath complex provided everything that modern athletic clubs now offer: exercise grounds, ball ports, swimming pools, libraries, conversation rooms, game rooms, and more. Some baths had attached libraries where one could read scrolls. Others had gardens, shops, and eating areas. Philosophers gave talks, poets recited works, business deals were negotiated, and gossip was exchanged. The Stabian baths in Pompeii even had an open-air swimming pool added after the city's aqueduct supplied ample water. Men and women usually bathed at different times of day or in separate facilities to maintain modesty. By midday, workers would pause their day for a relaxing dip. By late afternoon and evening, the baths were packed with friends gathering to chat, soak, and enjoy the social atmosphere. Beyond the baths, Romans flocked to public spectacles that provided excitement and entertainment on a grand scale. The amphitheater was the center of the most thrilling and brutal entertainment, gladiatorial games. These contests featured gladiators, usually slaves, prisoners of war, or condemned criminals, who fought each other or wild animals for the crowd's amusement. Gladiatorial combat was extraordinarily popular throughout the empire. The fighters, despite their low social status, became celebrities. Different types of gladiators had different armor, weapons, and fighting styles. The Murmillo, with his fish-crested helmet and sword, the Retiarius with his net and trident, the Thracian with his curved dagger. The crowd had favorites and bet on outcomes. The games were violent beyond modern imagination. Men fought to the death or serious injury while thousands cheered. One Pompeian source describes these games as cruel and violent as we cannot now even imagine. When a gladiator was defeated, the crowd's decision, indicated by thumbs up or down, might determine whether he lived or died, though the sponsor of the games made the final call. The passion for these games ran so deep that violence sometimes erupted among spectators. In 59 AD, Pompeii's amphitheater saw a deadly brawl break out between Pompeian spectators and visitors from the neighboring town of Nuceria. The riot was so severe that Emperor Nero temporarily banned gladiatorial games in Pompeii for 10 years as punishment. Beyond gladiatorial combat, amphitheaters hosted venationes, wild animal hunts where professional hunters fought bears, lions, leopards, and even elephants and rhinoceroses brought from Africa and Asia. Sometimes the arena was flooded to stage mock naval battles called naumachia, reenactments of famous sea battles with real ships and combatants. Romans also loved games of chance and skill in their daily lives. They were famously fond of dice games, playing with knuckle bones or carved dice called tesserae. At taverns, inns, and homes, people gathered to gamble, betting coins on the throw of dice or the fall of knucklebones. Despite laws that periodically tried to restrict gambling, it remained enormously popular. A leisurely citizen might spend an afternoon rolling dice for entertainment and small stakes, perhaps while reclining after a satisfying meal. Romans also enjoyed various ball games. They played a version of handball, trigon, which was a three-person game of catch where players stood at points of a triangle and threw multiple balls rapidly, and other games played with inflated leather balls. Even in the narrow streets, one might see people playing ball games on cooler days, though this sometimes annoyed neighbors when balls damaged property or disturbed the peace. The arts provided another form of entertainment. Every city of any size boasted at least one theater, usually an open-air structure with stone seating arranged in a semicircle facing a stage. Here, actors performed Greek tragedies, comedies, or pantomimes, often in connection with religious festivals. Entire communities would gather for these performances, with seating arranged by social rank, senators and officials in the best seats, common folk higher up. The shows provided intellectual stimulation and emotional release. Audiences might watch Euripides' Medea wrestle with her terrible choices, laugh at the clever schemes of Plautus's comedies, or be moved by pantomime performances where masked dancers acted out stories through gesture and movement. The theater of Pompeii could hold thousands of spectators, demonstrating how central theatrical entertainment was to urban life. Chariot racing thrilled crowds in ways similar to modern sports. At the Circus Maximus in Rome or local hippodromes in other cities, teams of horses pulled light chariots around oval tracks while thousands watched and wagered. Charioteers became celebrities, and fans were intensely loyal to their favorite racing factions, identified by colors: the blues, greens, reds, and whites. Races were dangerous. Chariots collided, drivers were thrown, horses stumbled. The excitement was electric. In quieter moments, especially for the educated classes, reading and writing provided private pleasures. Wealthier Romans might own small libraries of scrolls, reading works of philosophy, history, or poetry by lamplight. They might compose letters to friends or relatives in distant parts of the empire, seal them with wax, and send them via the imperial post system. Some tried their hand at writing poetry, attempting to match the elegant verses of Virgil or Ovid. Music filled Roman life at many levels. Street musicians played lyres and flutes for coins from passers-by. At dinner parties in wealthy homes, professional musicians performed while guests reclined and dined. Religious festivals featured ceremonial music. Children learned to sing and might perform for family gatherings. The sounds of flutes, lyres, horns, and percussion instruments were part of the soundscape of any Roman city. In summary, Roman leisure was rich, varied, and deeply valued. As historical sources note, Romans enjoyed various leisure activities: public baths for socializing and exercise, gladiatorial games and animal hunts for excitement, theater performances for culture, chariot races for competition, dice and board games for casual entertainment, and music and literature for quieter pleasures. Through these activities, from the violence of the arena to the relaxation of the baths, from gambling at dice games to watching theater performances, Romans unwound from their labors and found meaning, excitement, and community. Leisure was not wasted time, but an essential component of the good life, and Romans pursued it with the same energy and organization they brought to conquest and administration. Public spaces and infrastructure, the built environment. The Roman city itself was a marvel of planning and engineering, a built environment designed to serve public needs at every corner. Walking through a Roman city, one would be struck by the sophistication of its urban design and the quality of its infrastructure. The Forum stood at the heart of every Roman city, a large open plaza surrounded by the most important buildings. Here, political debates occurred, legal cases were heard, business was conducted, and the community gathered. The Forum was paved with large stones, often marble in wealthy cities, and featured temples dedicated to major gods like Jupiter, Juno, and Apollo. The Capitoline temple complex typically dominated one end of the Forum. its steps and columns visible from across the plaza. Basilicas lined the forum, large, covered halls where magistrates heard court cases, merchants made deals, and people gathered when weather was poor. These buildings featured high ceilings, columns, and often elaborate decoration. The Basilica Julia in Rome's forum could hold thousands. Surrounding the forum were colonnaded shops called tabernae, selling goods and services of every kind. During the day, the forum buzzed with activity, politicians giving speeches, lawyers arguing cases, merchants hawking wares, crowds gathering to hear news or participate in public life. Beyond the forum, Roman cities were organized along a grid of streets when topography allowed. Main roads called cardines ran north-south, while decumani ran east-west, creating regular blocks. Within the city, these stone streets featured raised sidewalks to keep pedestrians above the level of the road, and stepping stones were placed at intervals so people could cross streets without stepping in puddles, mud, or worse. Open drains along curbs carried away rainwater and waste, demonstrating that Romans took urban sanitation seriously. The most remarkable aspect of Roman urban infrastructure was the water system. Romans were justly famous for their aqueducts, engineering marvels that carried fresh spring water from distant hills into cities using gravity alone. These channels, sometimes carried on tall arched bridges across valleys, maintained a gentle downward slope over miles of distance. By the height of the empire, Rome itself boasted 11 major aqueducts, bringing millions of water daily into the city. Other cities had one or more aqueducts depending on their size and importance. This abundant water supply kept public fountains flowing continuously at street corners, filled the great public baths with fresh water, supplied public latrines, watered gardens, and even fed running water to some privileged private homes. In Pompeii, for example, a major aqueduct built in the 1st century BC piped water through lead pipes buried under the streets. These pipes fed fountains in wealthy houses and in the forum, ensuring that no resident was far from fresh water. The overflow from household fountains and public spouts ran into the roadway, helping to flush away rubbish into the drainage system. This constant flow of water helped keep the city cleaner and healthier than cities without such systems. Remarkably, Pompeii and other Roman cities had public latrines, communal toilets with rows of stone seats with holes. Beneath the seats ran channels of flowing water that carried waste away to cesspits or rivers. These facilities were flushed regularly by water from the aqueducts and cleaned by public slaves or private contractors. The existence of such public sanitation facilities was a mark of civic sophistication. As one historian notes, aqueduct water supplied public baths, latrines, fountains, and private homes, creating a water-extravagant way of life that underpinned public health. The availability of abundant clean water allowed Romans to bathe regularly, maintain their elaborate bath complexes, and keep their cities cleaner than most settlements would be until the modern era. Roman roads were engineering feats even within cities. They were solidly built in layers, large stones as foundation, smaller stones and gravel for fill, and fitted paving stones on top. This construction allowed heavy carts to move goods smoothly without damaging the road surface. The famous saying, "All roads lead to Rome," reflected the broader truth that Romans built thousands of miles of excellent roads connecting every part of their empire. Down the center of many streets ran an open gutter for rainwater and liquid waste, keeping the road surface relatively clean. Shops and houses opened directly onto sidewalks, providing easy access for customers. The streets themselves were public spaces where vendors set up temporary stalls, neighbors met and talked, children played when traffic allowed, and the life of the city unfolded. Outside the city walls, which many cities maintained for defense, the landscape was organized around roads, aqueducts, and property boundaries. Fields and vineyards spread across the countryside, interspersed with villas, farmhouses, and small villages. Major roads connected cities across the empire, allowing armies to march, merchants to travel, and officials to carry messages and decrees. Bridges spanned rivers when necessary, often built of stone with multiple arches, strong enough to last centuries. Some Roman bridges are still in use today, testament to their builders' skill. Aqueduct bridges were particularly impressive, their high arches carrying water channels across valleys, sometimes rising over 100 feet above the ground below. By evening, as the sun set, oil lamps would be lit throughout the city. These simple clay lamps, filled with olive oil and fitted with a wick, provided modest illumination. Wealthy homes might have dozens, while poor families made do with one or two. However, even a city full of oil lamps was quite dark by modern standards. After nightfall, Roman streets could be dangerous, and most people avoided traveling through the city at night unless necessary. The ancient writer Dionysius of Halicarnassus, observing the grandeur of Rome, noted that the empire's greatness manifests itself above all in three things: the aqueducts, the paved roads, and the construction of the drainage system. This observation recognizes that Rome's true achievement was not just military conquest, but the creation of livable, functional, sophisticated urban environments. The very stones of Roman cities testified to the ambition and skill of their architects and engineers. Walking through the ruins of Pompeii or Ostia today, we can still see the fountains that flowed, the latrines that served the public, the roads that carried traffic, and the forum where communities gathered. These public works made urban life possible at a scale and sophistication that would not be matched again in Europe for more than 1,000 years. Social classes and daily interaction, the hierarchy of Roman life. Underlying every aspect of Roman life was a strict and clearly defined social hierarchy. Roman society was organized into distinct classes, each with its own privileges, responsibilities, and limitations. Understanding these social divisions is essential to comprehending how Romans interacted and lived together in their cities. At the top of the social pyramid stood the patricians, members of ancient noble families who trace their lineage back to Rome's founding. These aristocrats controlled much of the political system, especially in the Republic's earlier days. They owned vast estates in the countryside, grand Domus in the city, and lived lives of considerable luxury and influence. Patrician families competed for honor and prestige through public service, military command, and lavish displays of wealth. Just below the patricians were the equestrians, originally the cavalry class. By the imperial period, equestrians were wealthy citizens who might not have ancient noble blood, but had substantial property and often engaged in commerce, banking, or provincial administration. They served as military officers, tax collectors, and administrators throughout the empire. The vast majority of free citizens were plebeians, common people who formed the backbone of Roman society. Plebeians worked as farmers, craftsmen, small merchants, soldiers, laborers, and countless other occupations. Their economic circumstances varied widely. Some plebeians were relatively prosperous shopkeepers or successful artisans, while others lived in poverty, struggling to feed their families. What united them was their status as free Roman citizens with certain legal rights and protections. Freedmen and freedwomen formed a unique intermediate group. These were former slaves who had been emancipated, either by purchasing their freedom, receiving it as a reward for faithful service, or being freed in their owner's will. Freedmen were technically free, but lacked some rights that freeborn citizens possessed. They could not hold high political office, for example, though their children born after emancipation would be full citizens. Many freedmen worked as traders, craftsmen, scribes, or business agents, and some became quite wealthy. However, they never fully escaped the social stigma of their former enslavement. At the bottom of the social order were the slaves, who were legally considered property rather than persons. Slaves had no legal rights, could not marry legally, could not own property, and were subjected entirely to their owner's will. Yet despite their legal status, slaves were integral to Roman society. They comprised perhaps a third of the population in cities, perhaps more. Slaves performed every conceivable task: household servants, agricultural laborers, miners, craftsmen, teachers, doctors, accountants, entertainers, and even business managers. The treatment of slaves varied enormously depending on their owners and their roles. Household slaves in kind families might be treated almost as family members, eating the same food and living in relative comfort. Educated Greek slaves often served as tutors and were respected for their learning. Some slaves ran businesses on behalf of their owners and enjoyed considerable autonomy. But slaves in mines, quarries, or large agricultural estates often endured horrific conditions: brutal labor, poor food, chains, whippings, and short lifespans. In daily life, class differences were visible and palpable. A patrician walking through the forum wore a clean white toga with a purple stripe, a garment that marked his status and required careful draping. He might be accompanied by clients, lower status men who depended on his patronage and who gathered at his home each morning to pay respects. A plebeian street vendor, by contrast, wore a simple tunic that left his arms and legs free for work, practical clothing that showed his status as a working man. Wealth dictated every comfort and opportunity. Only about 5% of Rome's urban population lived in private domus, while the vast majority crowded into insulae apartments. The patrician family might own dozens of slaves to handle every household task, while a working plebeian family might have none at all, or perhaps share the services of a slave with neighbors. Where one sat at public events clearly marked social rank. At the theater or amphitheater, senators and magistrates had the best seats at the front, under covered sections that protected them from sun and rain. Equestrians sat behind them, then ordinary plebeians further back. And finally, women and the poorest citizens in the highest, most distant seats with no shade. This seating arrangement made social hierarchy visible to everyone. Even in death, class distinctions persisted. Wealthy families built elaborate tomb monuments along roads outside the city, proclaiming their achievements and lineage to passersby for generations. Common people were buried in simple graves or placed in columbaria, communal buildings with niches for cremation urns. Slaves might be disposed of in mass graves with little ceremony. Yet, despite these stark divisions, classes also intermingled in routine moments. In the morning, a wealthy patrician might stop at the same public fountain as a humble plebeian to fill his water jug. A freedman banker dealt with clients of all ranks, handling money for both rich and poor. Customers in a street shop could range from elderly women buying olives to legionaries in uniform buying wine, to slaves shopping for their owners. The public baths were particularly democratic spaces, where the naked human body somewhat equalized social distinctions. Though even there, wealthy patrons might be attended by slaves and occupy better spaces. The forum brought together people of all classes for markets, festivals, and public speeches. Religious festivals included the entire community in shared celebration and worship. Everywhere, there was acute awareness of rank. Roman etiquette required showing proper respect to one's social superiors, addressing them with correct titles, giving way on the street, and observing countless small rituals of deference. To fail in these courtesies could result in insult or punishment. Yet within these constraints, simple human exchanges happened constantly, haggling over the price of bread, discussing the weather or the latest news, sharing a joke, helping a neighbor, expressing sympathy over a loss. Historians note that Roman daily life varied dramatically depending on one's social class. Marriage prospects, political opportunities, legal protections, housing, diet, clothing, occupation, and even life expectancy all depended on whether you were born patrician or plebeian, free or slave, male or female. Yet in its core, the city contained people living together under the same sun, sharing the same streets and spaces. Parents of all classes cared for their children, teaching them what they could and hoping for their success. Friends of similar status shared wine and confidences. Lovers from appropriate backgrounds strolled down colonnades, their hands touching, whispering promises. Neighbors helped each other in times of trouble. These universal human actions transcended status, reminding us that beneath the social hierarchy, Romans were people much like ourselves, navigating the challenges and joys of daily existence. Trade and economy, the lifeblood of the city. A Roman city thrived on trade and commerce. Economic activity was the lifeblood that kept the urban organism functioning, and the flow of goods through markets and ports determined the prosperity and even survival of cities and their inhabitants. At the foundation of the Roman economy was agriculture, particularly grain production. Rome itself consumed vast quantities of grain, far more than could be grown locally. The city's population of roughly 1 million people required steady imports from the grain-rich provinces of North Africa, Egypt, and Sicily. The annona, the state-organized grain supply, was a critical government function that helped keep the urban poor fed and prevented riots. The port of Ostia Antica at the mouth of the Tiber River served as Rome's primary harbor, and its daily operations show us how Roman trade functioned. Ships from across the Mediterranean unloaded cargo at Ostia's docks. Massive shipments of grain in sacks and amphorae, olive oil in pointed ceramic containers, wine in barrels, marble blocks from distant quarries, exotic goods from Africa and the East. City laborers at Ostia cataloged, stored, and guarded this precious cargo as part of their daily work. Warehouse workers rolled heavy amphorae into storage cellars. Scribes recorded inventories on wax tablets. Guards watched over valuable goods. Transport workers loaded grain and other products onto river barges that traveled up the Tiber to Rome. This constant activity employed thousands of people and kept the capital fed. But trade was not only about basic sustenance. Markets throughout the empire bustled with diverse regional products. Merchants offered Spanish olives and olive oil, considered among the finest. Wine from Gaul, particularly from regions that would become famous wine areas in later centuries, was highly prized. Pottery from Greek workshops in the eastern provinces was valued for its quality and beauty. Purple dye from Phoenicia, extracted laboriously from sea snails, colored the robes of emperors and the wealthy. Glassware from Syria, spices from the Far East carried along trade routes, Egyptian papyrus for writing, and countless other goods moved through Roman markets. Within cities, commerce happened everywhere and constantly. Along harbor fronts like Ostia's, long porticos of shops faced the river, where buyers and sellers haggled over cloth, preserved fish, lumber, and manufactured goods. Inside the forum and along side streets were specialized markets, a meat market or macellum, a fish market, a vegetable market, each with its own section and regular vendors. Bakers, butchers, and cloth sellers ran storefronts on busy corners throughout the city. These tabernae opened wide to the street with no glass windows, allowing customers to see and access goods directly. Businessmen paid daily rent for stall space at markets, and these commercial centers became social meeting places as much as economic ones. Friends might arrange to meet at a particular shop, knowing they could be found there at certain hours. As historical sources note, merchants traded goods like wine, oil, textiles, and spices across the vast Mediterranean, creating an integrated economic zone. Farmers produced wheat, olives, grapes, and livestock in the countryside. Craftsmen in urban workshops created pottery, weapons, jewelry, and thousands of household items, each specialist perfecting a particular skill over years of practice. Roman coinage facilitated all this trade. The silver denarius and bronze sestertius passed constantly through hands for purchases, wages, and tax payments. Coins bearing the emperor's image circulated throughout the empire, serving not just as money, but as propaganda, spreading the ruler's image to even remote corners of his domain. Inns, called calpone, and taverns collected payments in coin for meals and lodging. These establishments served travelers along major roads and local customers looking for a meal or drink. Some had poor reputations as places of gambling and prostitution, but they were essential parts of the economic and social infrastructure. Local craftsmen often engaged in barter alongside monetary transactions. A potter might trade his amphorae for produce from a farmer's market stall. A carpenter might repair a tavern keeper's tables in exchange for meals. This mixing of barter and cash transactions created a flexible economic system that could accommodate different levels of wealth and trust. Markets were noisy, colorful, crowded places. Vendors called out, praising their goods and insulting competitors. Customers examined produce carefully, smelling fish to check freshness, squeezing fruit to test ripeness, arguing over quality and price. Children learned the vocabulary of trade early. Numerarius meant money changer, Argentarius meant banker, and Caupo meant tavern keeper. Commerce was woven into the urban fabric so completely that even small children understood its basic operations. Taxes were a constant concern and topic of conversation. The Roman state collected various taxes: taxes on property, on commercial transactions, customs duties at ports, and special levies for military campaigns. Tax collectors, often equestrians who had bid for the right to collect taxes in a province, were generally unpopular, accused of extracting more than was legally due and pocketing the difference. By evening, shopkeepers closed their shutters and counted their day's takings by lamplight, stacking coins, recording the day's transactions on wax tablets. City street sweepers collected fallen coins and food scraps from the gutters, nothing being too small to have potential value. And as the sun set on the busy marketplace, one could still feel the economic heartbeat of the city. The promise of tomorrow's commerce, the arrival of new ships at the port, the constant flow of goods and money that kept urban life functioning. Trade connected the Roman world in ways both practical and profound. A citizen in Rome might eat bread made from Egyptian grain, dress in cloth dyed with Phoenician purple, write on Egyptian papyrus with a pen made of Spanish brass, drink wine from Gaul poured from a Greek amphora, sweeten his food with honey from Attica, and season it with pepper from India, all while sitting on furniture made from African citrus wood. This vast economic web, maintained by countless merchants, shippers, craftsmen, and traders, was one of Rome's greatest achievement. Nightfall and family evenings, the day's end. As the golden light of sunset faded from the western sky and shadows lengthened across the stone streets, the Roman city gradually grew quiet. The bustling activity of the day gave way to the calmer rhythms of evening and night. Markets closed as vendors packed away unsold goods, closed shutters over their shop fronts, and departed for home. The Forum, so crowded and noisy during the day, became nearly empty as citizens concluded their business and legal proceedings ended. Workers returning from jobs outside the city walls streamed through the gates before they closed at dusk. The city's pulse, which had quickened at dawn and maintained a steady beat all day, now began to slow. Many Romans returned home for supper, the final meal of the day, called vesperna or Cena if it was the main meal. For working families, this was often just a light repast of leftovers and bread, perhaps some cheese or olives, whatever remained from earlier meals or could be quickly prepared. The meal was simple, but provided a moment for the family to gather together after a day spent at separate tasks. In Pompeian households and homes throughout the empire, family members gathered in the peristyle garden courtyard, if weather permitted, or in the atrium if it was cold. They might sit on benches or recline on simple couches, talking about the day's events. What happened at the market? How was work? Did the children behave at school? Any news from the Forum? These ordinary conversations, repeated in countless homes, wove the fabric of family life. Oil lamps were lit as darkness fell, casting a warm, flickering glow on painted walls, mosaics, or the simple whitewashed plaster of modest homes. The statues or paintings of household gods at the Lararium might receive a final prayer before sleep, a small offering of thanks for the day's blessings, and a request for protection through the night. In higher status homes, where dinner might have been an elaborate affair with guests, musicians, or poets, might still be entertaining select visitors. But for most families, the evening was a time to rest and recover from the day's labors. Children's bedtime in a Roman household came early. By the time darkness had fully fallen, children knew it was time to put aside their toys and games. They would say goodnight to their parents and perhaps to grandparents or other relatives living in the household. They might whisper brief prayers at the Lararium, asking the Lares to watch over them while they slept. Then they would lie down on wooden couches or simple mattresses, often stuffed with straw or wool, located near the hearth for warmth. In wealthier homes, children had their own small bedrooms off the atrium or peristyle. In cramped insula apartments, children might sleep in the same room as their parents, or in a small alcove. Regardless of wealth, Roman children generally went to bed early. As one Pompeian schedule indicates, Romans went to bed soon after their evening meal, rising again at dawn to begin the cycle anew. In the city's markets and public squares, only night watchmen or late shift laborers remained on duty, and even they walked cautiously through the dark streets. Romans generally considered travel through the city after dark to be unsafe. Without street lighting, beyond the occasional lamp hung outside a shrine or wealthy home, the streets were treacherous. Thieves operated under cover of darkness, and even innocent stumbles on uneven paving or into open drains were risks. Some establishments remained open after dark. Inns along major roads like the Via Appia still welcomed late-arriving travelers, offering them simple meals and straw beds for the night. Taverns in rougher neighborhoods might continue serving wine to laborers and off-duty soldiers. The baths stayed open into the evening hours, lit by numerous lamps, though most patrons had already bathed and gone home. Around the city, oil lamps flickered in windows and hallways, but these lights were modest. A single oil lamp gave light roughly equivalent to a candle, casting a small circle of illumination surrounded by deep shadows. Even a wealthy home with dozens of lamps remained quite dim by modern standards. Most people simply went to sleep when it became too dark to work or read comfortably, conserving lamp oil and aligning their schedules with natural light. In the countryside beyond the city walls, farmhouses and villas also went dark. Farmers and agricultural workers rose at dawn to tend animals and crops, so they retired early. Only the stars and moon illuminated the silent fields and vineyards. Perhaps a dog barked at some night sound, or an owl called from a tree, but otherwise the rural night was peaceful and still. Thus closed another day in the Roman world. From the first flicker of the morning torch at the household lararium to the final hushed prayer before the lamps were extinguished at night, daily life had gently turned its wheel of routine. The same patterns that had played out this day would repeat tomorrow and the day after, with minor variations but essential continuity, the rhythm of Roman life continuing as it had for generations and would for generations more. Reflections on Roman daily life. Connecting past and present. Our calm journey through a typical day in an ancient Roman city draws to a close, but the echoes and lessons of that ancient world continue to resonate across the centuries. The experience of walking virtually through Roman streets, entering Roman homes, and observing Roman routines reminds us that history is not merely the story of emperors, battles, and grand political movements. History is also, perhaps primarily, the story of ordinary people living ordinary lives. The stones we've walked upon, the fountains we've imagined flowing with fresh water, the bread we've pictured being bought at morning markets, all these were once utterly real, tangible parts of daily existence for millions of people. Archaeology has opened a vivid and intimate window onto that past. As historical sources note, Pompeii's preserved streets and buildings provide an exceptional source of information about daily life in the Roman Empire. The volcanic ash that buried the city in 79 AD acted as a preservative, capturing a single moment in time and allowing us to see Roman life with extraordinary clarity and detail. Walking through the excavated ruins of Pompeii or Ostia Antica today, visitors can still see the wheel ruts worn into stone streets by countless passing carts, the counters of shops where goods were sold, the faded frescoes on villa walls, and the public fountains that once flowed constantly with aqueduct water. These physical remains speak to us across 2 millennia, telling stories of human lives lived in very different circumstances, but motivated by familiar desires and needs. The ancient historian Dionysius of Halicarnassus, observing the grandeur of Rome in his own time, noted that the empire's extraordinary greatness manifests itself above all in 3 things: the aqueducts that brought clean water to millions, the paved roads that connected the known world, and the construction of drainage systems that kept cities sanitary. This observation is profound because it recognizes that Rome's true achievement was not just military conquest or territorial expansion. The real wonder was the creation of livable, functional, sophisticated urban environments where people could thrive. These civic marvels, the aqueducts and roads and sewers that Dionysius admired, served ordinary people's daily needs. They allowed cities to grow beyond the normal limits imposed by local water sources. They facilitated trade and communication across vast distances. They made urban life healthier and more pleasant. These were not monuments to imperial ego, but practical solutions to real problems, and they worked remarkably well for centuries. As we've journeyed through this Roman day, we've encountered people engaged in activities that remain fundamentally human and relatable. We've seen parents caring for their children, teaching them skills and values. We've watched workers leaving home at dawn to earn their daily bread through honest labor. We've observed families gathering for meals, sharing food and conversation. We've witnessed people at prayer, seeking connection with the divine and meaning in their existence. We've seen communities coming together for entertainment, finding joy in spectacles, games, and performances. These moments of daily life, repeated millions of times across the centuries of Roman civilization, remind us of the continuity of human experience. The specific details change. We use different technologies, wear different clothes, worship different gods or none at all, organize our societies differently. But the fundamental experiences of being human remain constant. We still need food and shelter. We still form families and communities. We still work and play, worship and wonder, hope and fear. The Roman family gathering in their atrium at dusk, lighting lamps and saying prayers to their household gods, was engaged in an act of creating meaning and security in an uncertain world. The modern family gathering in their living room, perhaps lighting candles or saying grace before a meal, is doing something fundamentally similar. The forms differ, but the human need for ritual, connection, and meaning persists. The Roman worker rising at dawn to fetch water and begin the day's labor faced challenges we might find difficult: no running water in the home, no electric light, no modern conveniences. Yet that worker also experienced satisfactions we might recognize: the pride of skilled work well done, the camaraderie of colleagues, the relief of returning home after a hard day, the simple pleasure of rest and food and family. The Roman child learning to write on a wax tablet, practicing letters under a strict teacher's eye, was acquiring literacy much as children today do, though with different tools and methods. That child's excitement at mastering a new skill, frustration at difficult lessons, and relief when the school day ended are emotions that connect directly to the experiences of students today. In every era and culture, humans have created systems and structures to organize their collective life. The Romans were particularly successful at this, building institutions and infrastructure that lasted for centuries and influenced all subsequent Western civilization. Their legal system gave us concepts of justice and citizenship that we still use. Their architectural innovations, like the arch and the dome and the concrete construction technique, made possible buildings of unprecedented scale and complexity. Their language, Latin, became the foundation for the Romance languages and contributed countless words to English and other tongues. But beyond these grand achievements, the Romans also simply lived, waking and sleeping, eating and drinking, working and resting, loving and arguing, being born and dying. In that sense, the true wonder is human continuity across time. To walk among the rooftops and ruins of Pompeii or Ostia is to know that long ago, someone else stood in nearly the same spot at dawn, watching the sun rise over the Mediterranean, wondering what the day would bring, perhaps feeling a moment of peace or anxiety or hope. The Roman baker opening his shop as dawn broke, breathing in the warm smell of fresh bread from his oven, experienced a moment of satisfaction that any baker or craftsman today might recognize. The Roman mother soothing a crying infant in the middle of the night, exhausted but determined, knew an experience that connects her to mothers across all human history. The Roman elder, watching the sunset from a peristyle garden, reflecting on a long life, felt emotions that elderly people in every era have felt. These connections across time are not merely sentimental observations. They are important reminders that history is not just about the powerful and famous, the generals and emperors whose names we remember. History is made by countless ordinary people living ordinary lives, making small choices and performing daily tasks that collectively create the texture and reality of civilization. The household servant sweeping the atrium floor was maintaining not just cleanliness, but a tradition of domestic order. The merchant tallying his accounts was participating in economic systems that connected regions and peoples. The priest tending the temple fire was preserving religious traditions that gave meaning to community life. Each person, however humble their role, was a necessary thread in the vast tapestry of Roman civilization. As we leave the silent forum to return to our own streets and our own time, we can carry with us several important insights. First, that the past is not as distant or different as we might imagine. The gap of 2,000 years seems immense, but the archaeological evidence shows us that Roman daily life was lived at a human scale we can understand and relate to. Second, that civilization is built not primarily through great deeds and dramatic events, but through the steady accumulation of ordinary actions. The fountains that flowed, the roads that carried traffic, the markets that buzzed with commerce, the homes that sheltered families, all these were maintained by countless people doing their work day after day, year after year, generation after generation. Third, that the simple actions and enduring structures of daily life connect ancient Rome to our world today. When we turn on a tap and water flows, we benefit from engineering principles the Romans mastered. When we drive on paved roads, we travel descendants of Roman roads. When we participate in democratic governance, we engage with political concepts Romans developed. When we study Latin-derived words, we speak with Roman echoes. The connections are everywhere once we look for them. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, that understanding how people lived in the past helps us understand ourselves better. By seeing how Romans organized their cities, structured their families, practiced their religions, conducted their commerce, and spent their leisure time, we gain perspective on our own choices and arrangements. We see which aspects of human life are universal and which are culturally specific. We recognize both the diversity of human experience and its fundamental unity. The Roman who gazed at the stars from an atrium courtyard saw the same stars we see, though he understood them through different myths and cosmologies. He felt wonder at the vastness of the cosmos, perhaps, or found comfort in the regular movements of celestial bodies, or simply enjoyed a moment of beauty before sleep. These responses to the night sky are timeless, connecting that ancient person to us and to all humans who have paused to look upward. As night falls on our virtual Roman city for the final time, we can imagine one last scene. A family in their modest home, a father and mother and their children finishing their simple evening meal. The children are sent to bed with kisses and blessings. The parents sit together for a moment in the lamplight, perhaps holding hands, reviewing the day, making plans for tomorrow. They offer a final prayer at the household shrine, thanking the gods for another day of life, asking protection for the night. Then they extinguish most of the lamps, leaving just one burning low to light the way if someone wakes in the night. They lie down to sleep, tired from the day's work, but content, surrounded by their family, secure in their home, part of a community and a civilization that feels solid and permanent. They do not know, cannot imagine, that 2,000 years later, people will study their lives, walk through the ruins of their streets, and try to understand how they lived. But we know, and in knowing, in making the effort to understand and imagine their lives, we honor them. We recognize that they were not so different from us, that their hopes and fears, their joys and sorrows, their daily routines and special celebrations were expressions of the same human spirit that animates our own lives. The past lives quietly within us, in the words we speak, the laws we follow, the buildings we inhabit, the traditions we maintain, even when we do not realize it. The simple actions of Roman daily life, fetching water at dawn, buying bread in the market, bathing in the afternoon, gathering with family at evening, saying prayers at night, these actions echo forward through time, connecting us to those ancient people and reminding us of our shared humanity. So, as we conclude this journey through a day in ancient Rome, let us carry forward an appreciation for the ordinary miracles of daily life, the small routines and simple pleasures that make existence meaningful. Let us remember that history is not just carved in stone monuments and recorded in official chronicles, but is lived in every home, on every street, in every moment of every ordinary day. The Roman city sleeps now, its streets empty, its lamps extinguished, but the memory lives on, preserved in ruins and artifacts, in written records and archaeological discoveries, in the very foundations of Western civilization. And when we study that memory with care and imagination, the ancient world comes alive again, speaking to us across the centuries, reminding us that we are all part of the same long human story. Thank you for joining this calm journey through ancient Roman daily life. May you carry forward a sense of connection to the past and an appreciation for the enduring patterns of human existence that unite us across time and culture. May you see the Roman legacy in your own daily life, and may you recognize that your own ordinary actions, like theirs, are part of history in the making. Sleep well, as those Romans did 2,000 years ago, and wake to a new dawn, as they did, ready to engage with whatever the day brings. The wheel of life turns on, connecting past to present to future, and we are all part of that eternal turning. The information presented in this journey through Roman daily life has been carefully drawn from archaeological evidence and historical sources, with particular emphasis on the preserved cities of Pompeii and Ostia Antica. These remarkable sites provide our most detailed understanding of how ordinary Romans actually lived. Pompeii, buried by Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD, has been described as preserving the city like a time capsule, offering an unparalleled record of life in the Roman Empire. The volcanic ash that covered the city happened to preserve organic materials, wooden structures, and everyday objects that normally would have decayed, giving archaeologists extraordinary insight into Roman daily existence. The sources consulted for this presentation include museum collections and educational resources from the Western Australian Museum, the official Pompeii archaeological site, smart history articles on Roman domestic architecture, Britannica entries on Roman religion and home life, ThoughtCo analyses of Roman housing, History Skills educational resources on Roman social structure, the Archaeologist magazine articles on Roman daily life, Ancient Rome Live resources on commerce and ports, Bruminate scholarly articles on Roman entertainment and leisure, Toto World research on Roman domestic religion, and Wikipedia articles on agriculture, aqueducts, and military diet, among others. These diverse sources have been synthesized to create a comprehensive picture of Roman daily life that is both accurate to current historical understanding and accessible to general audiences. The journey you have experienced represents the scholarly consensus on how Romans lived, worked, worshipped, and entertained themselves during the height of their civilization. While we can never know every detail of ancient lives, and while individual experiences varied greatly depending on wealth, status, and location, the broad patterns and structures of Roman daily existence are well documented and understood. The Romans left behind not just monuments and inscriptions, but the physical remains of their daily world, waiting to teach us about our shared human past. Thank you for joining this calm journey through ancient Roman daily life. May you carry forward a sense of connection to the past and an appreciation for the enduring patterns of human existence that unite us across time and culture. May you see the Roman legacy in your own daily life, and may you recognize that your own ordinary actions, like theirs, are part of history in the making. Sleep well, as those Romans did 2,000 years ago, and wake to a new dawn, as they did, ready to engage with whatever the day brings. The wheel of life turns on, connecting past to present to future, and we are all part of that eternal turning. May this journey inspire you to learn more about ancient Rome and to reflect on the connections between past and present that make history meaningful and relevant to our own lives. The story of Rome is ultimately the story of people like ourselves, trying to build good lives in their own time and place, and their successes and failures have much to teach us still. The Roman family, bonds across generations. To truly understand Roman daily life, we must delve deeper into the institution that formed its foundation, the familia. The Roman family was more than just parents and children living under one roof. It was a complex social and legal unit that included not only blood relatives, but also slaves, freedmen, clients, and sometimes even business associates who lived within the household or depended upon it. The pater familias, the male head of household, held a position of authority that is difficult for modern people to fully comprehend. His patria potestas, or paternal power, gave him legal control over every member of his household throughout his life. His wife, though she might be a respected matrona managing daily household affairs, remained legally under his authority. His children, even after they became adults, technically remained subject to his power until his death, though in practice adult children often lived independently. This legal structure might seem oppressive to modern sensibilities, but in practice, family relationships were governed more by affection, custom, and mutual obligation than by the strict exercise of legal rights. Letters preserved from ancient Rome show fathers expressing deep love for their children, husbands praising their wives' virtues, and adult children caring tenderly for aging parents. The familia was bound together by emotional ties as much as legal ones. The Roman mother, though lacking the legal authority of her husband, wielded considerable practical power within the household. She supervised slaves and servants, managed the household budget, oversaw food preparation and storage, educated young children, arranged marriages for her children, and maintained family relationships with extended relatives. In wealthy families, the matrona hosted social gatherings, managed charitable giving, and played an important role in her husband's political and social advancement. Roman mothers nursed their own children when possible, creating strong early bonds. They sang lullabies, told stories, and taught the first lessons in proper behavior and religious observance. The relationship between Roman mothers and their children was characterized by deep affection and lifelong connection. When mothers died young, as many did in childbirth or from disease, their loss was deeply mourned, as countless funeral inscriptions attest. Children in Roman families occupied a special position. They were cherished and protected, yet also expected to show absolute obedience and respect to their parents and elders. From infancy, children learned their place in the family hierarchy and in society at large. They observed religious rituals, family meals, social interactions with clients and friends, and countless other aspects of adult life, gradually absorbing the customs and expectations of Roman culture. Siblings formed important relationships that often lasted throughout life. Brothers might work together in the family business or farm. Sisters maintained close connections even after marriage took them to different households. The extended family, including grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins, formed a network of support and obligation that helped individuals navigate life's challenges. In the homes of wealthy families, slaves were an integral part of the familia. Some slaves were treated almost as family members, eating with the family, participating in religious observances, and even receiving affection and trust. Slave nurses who raised children from infancy often maintained close relationships with them into adulthood. Educated slaves who served as tutors influenced their young charges' intellectual development and moral formation. Skilled slaves who managed household operations or business affairs held positions of real responsibility and authority within their spheres. However, we must not romanticize the institution of slavery. Regardless of how well individual slaves might be treated, they lacked fundamental freedom and rights. They could be sold, punished, or even killed at their owner's discretion, though by the imperial period, laws increasingly restricted owners' absolute power over slaves' lives. The best-treated household slave remained property, and the worst-treated slaves in mines or on farms endured lives of unimaginable brutality. Family meals were sacred times of bonding and tradition. Even poor families tried to eat together when possible. The father might recline at the head of the table in wealthier homes or sit on a stool in modest households. He would lead prayers to the household gods before eating. Food was shared from common dishes, fostering a sense of unity. Conversation flowed. The day's events were discussed, family news was shared, plans were made, and younger members learned by listening to their elders. Family religious observances reinforced bonds and tradition. The Lararium received daily attention from family members, usually the mother and children. On special family occasions, birthdays, weddings, funerals, more elaborate rituals were performed. The family participated together in public religious festivals, wearing their best clothes and joining the community in celebration and worship. Marriage in Roman society was both a personal relationship and a socio-economic arrangement. Marriages were typically arranged by families, with considerations of property, social status, and political alliance playing major roles. However, many Roman marriages also developed into partnerships of genuine affection and respect. Husbands and wives worked together to advance their family's interests, raise children, and create a comfortable home life. Roman wedding ceremonies involved elaborate rituals. The bride wore a special white tunic and an orange veil. A formal procession conducted her from her father's house to her new husband's home. She was ritually carried over the threshold, symbolizing her transition from daughter to wife. Wedding feasts celebrated the union, with guests from both families joining in elaborate meals and entertainment. Once married, couples often shared lives of partnership and cooperation. While the husband handled public affairs and was the legal head of household, the wife managed domestic matters with considerable autonomy. Many funerary inscriptions celebrate long marriages, with surviving spouses praising their deceased partner's virtues, loyalty, and the happiness they shared. Divorce was legally possible and not uncommon, especially among the upper classes. Either spouse could initiate divorce, though the social and economic consequences were quite different for men and women. A divorced woman might return to her birth family or live independently if she had means. Divorced men could remarry easily. Despite the legal ease of divorce, many Romans valued marriage stability and worked to maintain their unions. The birth of children was a moment of joy, but also danger. Maternal mortality was high, and many infants died within their first year. Families who successfully raised children to adulthood considered themselves blessed by the gods. Each child's birth was marked by religious rituals, offerings to the household gods, purification ceremonies, and eventually the formal naming of the child, usually occurring 8 or 9 days after birth. Roman parents invested heavily in their children's futures. They arranged educations, sought appropriate marriage partners, set children up in businesses or professions, and provided inheritances. The relationship between parents and adult children was expected to be characterized by pietas, a complex concept encompassing duty, respect, affection, and mutual care. Adult children were obligated to care for aging parents, and parents remained interested in their children's welfare throughout life. Grandparents played important roles when present. They told stories of family history, transmitted traditions, helped with childcare, and provided wisdom gained from long experience. The respect shown to the elderly in Roman culture meant that grandparents' opinions carried weight in family decisions. Their deaths were mourned not just as personal losses, but as the severing of living links to the family's past. Family property and wealth passed through generations, creating continuity. A successful family accumulated land, slaves, goods, and reputation over generations. The pressure to maintain and enhance family status motivated much of Roman social and economic behavior. Conversely, the decline of a once prominent family was seen as a tragedy, sometimes despite the individual merits of its later members. The familia extended beyond the household to include clients, freedmen with continuing obligations to former masters, business partners, and even friends, bound by strong ties of reciprocal obligation. This broader network functioned as an economic and social safety net, a power base for political activity, and a source of identity and belonging. In times of trouble, war, famine, disease, or personal crisis, the familia provided support and refuge. Family members were expected to help each other, sometimes at considerable personal cost. This expectation of family loyalty was so strong that betraying family members was considered one of the worst possible offenses. The Roman family, in all its complexity, was the fundamental building block of society. It was where citizens were raised, where values were transmitted, where economic production often occurred, and where religion was primarily practiced. Understanding the familia helps us understand how Roman society functioned and why family relationships were so central to Roman identity and daily life. Slavery in Roman society, a complex institution. No examination of Roman daily life would be complete without a more thorough consideration of slavery, an institution so fundamental to Roman civilization that it affected every aspect of society. Modern people often find slavery morally abhorrent, as indeed they should, but to understand the Romans, we must examine how this institution actually functioned in their world. Slavery in ancient Rome was not based on race or ethnicity, as it would be in later Atlantic slavery. Romans enslaved people of all backgrounds: Greeks, Gauls, Germans, Africans, Britons, Syrians, and even other Romans who fell into debt or were captured in civil wars. Anyone could potentially become a slave through conquest, piracy, brigandage, debt, or being born to a slave mother. The number of slaves in Roman society was substantial. Scholars estimate that in Italy, during the height of the empire, perhaps 25 to 40% of the population were slaves. In cities, the proportion might have been even higher. This meant that most Romans encountered slaves daily, and many households owned at least one or two slaves if they could afford it. The experience of being a slave varied enormously depending on multiple factors: the owner's character and wealth, the slave's skills and education, the type of work required, and luck. This variation makes it difficult to generalize about slave life, but we can identify some distinct categories. Household slaves in kind urban families might have relatively tolerable lives. They worked as cooks, cleaners, childminders, personal attendants, messengers, and in countless other domestic roles. They typically lived in their owner's home, ate the same basic food as the family, and might develop personal relationships with family members. Some household slaves, particularly those who had grown up in the household or who cared for children, were treated with real affection. Educated slaves, often Greeks captured in war, served as tutors, secretaries, accountants, doctors, or in other skilled positions. These slaves might be highly respected for their knowledge and abilities, though this respect did not translate into freedom or legal rights. Some educated slaves managed substantial aspects of their owner's affairs and lived comfortably, but they remained property nonetheless. Skilled slaves worked as craftsmen, artisans, and in various trades. Some operated workshops or businesses on behalf of their owners, keeping a portion of the profits for themselves. These slaves might accumulate their own peculium, a fund they could eventually use to purchase freedom. A talented slave craftsman might live and work much like a free person of similar occupation, though without legal independence. Agricultural slaves on large estates faced much harder lives. They worked long hours in fields, often under brutal overseers, sometimes chained together to prevent escape. These slaves lived in barrack-like accommodations, received minimal food and clothing, and were worked hard to maximize the estate's productivity. Their life expectancy was short, and many died young from overwork, malnutrition, disease, or punishment. Slaves in mines and quarries endured the worst conditions. Mining was dangerous, exhausting work performed in darkness, heat, and dust. These slaves were often criminals or prisoners of war, effectively sentenced to death by hard labor. Few survived more than a few years. The mines were Rome's hell, places of suffering that we can barely imagine. Gladiatorial slaves occupied a unique position. While their profession was brutal and often fatal, successful gladiators could become celebrities, earning prize money and even eventually winning freedom. Gladiators received better food than most slaves, medical care to keep them fighting fit, and lived in specialized barracks. However, they faced death or serious injury with each fight, and many died young in the arena. The sexual exploitation of slaves was common and accepted in Roman society. Masters had complete sexual access to their slaves of any age or gender, and slave women and children were particularly vulnerable to abuse. Slave women might be forced into prostitution by their owners or simply used sexually within the household. This aspect of slavery was particularly cruel and dehumanizing. However, Roman slavery did have features that distinguished it from later forms of slavery. Slaves could own property, including other slaves, though technically this property belonged to their masters. Slaves could make contracts and conduct business on their owner's behalf. Most importantly, manumission, the freeing of slaves, was relatively common in Roman society. Masters freed slaves for various reasons: as a reward for faithful service, in their wills as a final act of generosity, upon receiving payment from the slave's peculium, or sometimes from genuine affection. The promise of eventual freedom gave some slaves hope and motivation to work hard and please their masters. Freedmen became free people, though they retained certain obligations to their former masters and bore the social stigma of having been enslaved. Freedmen could marry legally, own property freely, and pass citizenship to their children. Some freedmen became wealthy through business success. The freedman Trimalchio, though a fictional character in Petronius's Satyricon, represents the possibility of former slaves achieving prosperity, though Petronius also satirized their often vulgar display of new wealth and their never quite belonging to respectable society. The children of freedmen born after manumission were full Roman citizens with no legal disabilities. This meant that within 2 generations, a family could move from slavery to full citizenship, an upward mobility that contrasted with racial slavery systems where status was permanent and hereditary. The children of freedmen born after manumission were full Roman citizens with no legal disabilities. This meant that within 2 generations, a family could move from slavery to full citizenship, an upward mobility that contrasted with racial slavery systems where status was permanent and hereditary. Roman law increasingly regulated slavery, limiting owners' absolute power in some ways. By the imperial period, owners could not kill slaves without justification, could not force them into gladiatorial combat without reason, and had to treat them with some minimal standard of care. However, these legal protections were limited and often ignored in practice. Some Romans, particularly Stoic philosophers, questioned the morality of slavery. Seneca wrote that slaves were human beings deserving of respect and kindness. However, even those who advocated treating slaves humanely did not call for the abolition of slavery itself. The institution was too fundamental to the Roman economy and society to be seriously questioned. Slaves resisted their condition in various ways. Some ran away, though if caught, they faced terrible punishment, including branding, beatings, or being forced to work in chains. Some killed abusive masters, though this was rare and resulted in execution of the guilty slave and often other slaves in the household as well. More commonly, slaves practiced subtle resistance, working slowly, accidentally breaking things, feigning illness, or other small acts of defiance. The most famous slave resistance was the Spartacus Rebellion of 73 to 71 BC, when gladiatorial slaves led a massive uprising that grew to include tens of thousands of escaped slaves. For 2 years, they defeated Roman armies before finally being crushed. 6,000 captured rebels were crucified along the Appian Way as a warning. This rebellion haunted Roman memory and increased fear of slave revolts, leading to harsher controls. Despite the cruelty inherent in slavery, personal relationships between slaves and owners sometimes developed that complicated the simple master-slave dynamic. A slave nurse who raised a child from infancy might be loved as a second mother. A slave tutor who educated a child might be respected as a teacher and mentor. A slave who had served a family for decades might be trusted with important responsibilities and consulted on family matters. These relationships did not negate the fundamental injustice of slavery, but they showed that human affection and respect could exist even within oppressive structures. When we walk through Pompeii or other Roman sites today, we must remember that much of what we admire was built by slave labor. The beautiful mosaics were laid by slave artisans. The elegant gardens were maintained by slave gardeners. The comfortable homes were cleaned by slave servants. The delicious meals were prepared by slave cooks. The very stones of Roman civilization bear the invisible marks of countless enslaved hands. Understanding Roman slavery helps us comprehend the full complexity of Roman society. It reminds us that civilizations we admire for their achievements in law, engineering, architecture, and governance can simultaneously commit terrible moral wrongs. It challenges us to think critically about our own society's inequalities and injustices, and it honors the memory of millions of enslaved people who lived, suffered, worked, and died to build a civilization that has shaped our modern world. Women's lives in ancient Rome beyond the stereotypes. The lives of women in ancient Rome were complex and varied, defying simple generalizations. While Roman women lived in a patriarchal society that limited their formal political and legal rights, many women exercised considerable practical power and lived lives of relative autonomy, creativity, and influence. Understanding Roman women's daily experiences gives us a fuller picture of Roman society. Legally, Roman women were perpetual minors, always under the authority of a man, first their father, then their husband, or if widowed, sometimes a male guardian. Women could not vote, hold political office, or serve in the military. In legal proceedings, they usually needed male representatives. This legal subordination reflected cultural beliefs about women's supposed intellectual and emotional inferiority to men. However, legal theory and daily reality often differed significantly. By the imperial period, many legal restrictions on women had been relaxed or were simply ignored in practice. Wealthy women owned property, made wills, conducted business, and managed substantial estates. The matrona of a prominent family wielded real power through her household management, her influence over her husband and children, and her social connections. A Roman woman's life course followed a predictable pattern determined by her social class. Girls were born into families that might celebrate their arrival, or, in the earliest periods, even choose to reject them through exposure. However, by the imperial period, most families raised their daughters with care. Baby girls were named, usually on the 8th day after birth, and became recognized members of their familia. Childhood for girls centered on the home. While boys might attend schools and learn public skills, girls typically received education at home from their mothers, female relatives, and sometimes slave tutors. They learned to read and write, skills increasingly considered important for managing households and raising educated children. Some wealthy girls received more extensive education in literature, music, and arts. But the primary focus of girls' education was preparation for their future role as wives and mothers. They learned to spin wool, weave cloth, sew, cook, manage servants, keep household accounts, and perform religious rituals. They observed their mothers and learned by doing, gradually taking on more household responsibilities as they grew. Roman girls typically married young, often in their early to mid-teens, to men significantly older. Marriage was primarily a family arrangement designed to create alliances and produce legitimate children. The girl often had little say in choosing her husband, though fathers were encouraged to consider their daughters' preferences, and some daughters successfully rejected unwanted matches. The wedding ceremony, as described earlier, was an elaborate affair filled with rituals that symbolically transferred the bride from her father's authority to her husband's. However, the specific form of marriage affected women's legal status. In the older cum manu marriage, a wife came completely under her husband's control. In the increasingly common sine manu marriage, a wife remained legally connected to her birth family, giving her more independence and property rights. Once married, a woman's primary duty was bearing children, especially sons. Pregnancy and childbirth were dangerous, and many young women died in labor or from complications. Those who survived multiple births often suffered health problems. Infant mortality was also high, so women might bear many children to ensure some survived to adulthood. The pain of losing children was profound, as countless funerary inscriptions attest. Successful mothers gained respect and status. The matrona, or respectable married woman, occupied an honored position in Roman society. She managed her household with authority, supervised slaves and servants, organized meals and entertainment, maintained family relationships, educated young children, and represented her family in social situations. In wealthy families, a capable matrona was essential to her husband's success. Some Roman women achieved remarkable autonomy and influence. Imperial women, the wives, mothers, sisters, and daughters of emperors, could wield enormous power. Livia, wife of Augustus, was respected as a power behind the throne. Agrippina the Younger maneuvered her son Nero onto the throne. Julia Domna, wife of Septimius Severus, was a learned woman who patronized philosophers and played a major role in governance. Wealthy women outside the imperial family also exercised influence. Some owned businesses, lent money, sponsored public buildings or festivals, and acted as patronesses to clients and friends. Women like Umachia in Pompeii funded substantial public buildings. Such women used their wealth and social connections to gain honor and respect, finding ways to exercise power despite formal exclusion from politics. Middle-class and working-class women's lives were shaped by economic necessity. Many worked alongside their husbands in family businesses, running shops, making textiles, operating inns or taverns. Some women worked independently as midwives, wet nurses, hairdressers, or in other female-dominated occupations. These working women had less leisure than their wealthy counterparts, but also more practical autonomy. Poor women faced the hardest lives. They worked as agricultural laborers, hauled water, washed clothes, spun and wove for tiny wages, or survived through prostitution or begging. They lived in cramped insulae apartments, struggling to feed their children and keep their families together. Their lives were constrained by poverty and exhausting labor, with little time or energy for anything beyond survival. Women's religious roles were significant. Women participated fully in household religion, often taking primary responsibility for maintaining the lararium and performing daily rituals. In public religion, women served as priestesses in various cults. The Vestal Virgins, who tended Rome's sacred fire, were among the most respected religious figures in Roman society, enjoying privileges and honors denied to other women. Women attended festivals, theaters, and games, though often in separate seating or at different times than men. They visited the baths in separate facilities or at different hours. They shopped in markets, visited friends and relatives, and participated in the social life of their communities. Respectable women were expected to behave modestly and avoid situations that might compromise their reputation, but they were not completely secluded. Some Roman women were educated and literate. They read books, wrote letters, and engaged in intellectual pursuits. Women poets like Sulpicia left written works. Educated women hosted salons where philosophical and literary discussions occurred. However, advanced education remained rare for women even in wealthy families. Widowhood could bring women increased freedom. A widow, especially one past childbearing age with adult children, might live independently, managing her own property and making her own decisions. Some widows remarried, others chose to remain single and enjoy their autonomy. Widows could act as guardians for their minor children and run family businesses. Divorce, while legally easy, had different consequences for men and women. A divorced woman might lose custody of her children, as they belonged to their father's familia. She might face social stigma, especially if she left her husband. However, some women initiated divorces and rebuilt their lives successfully, particularly if they had their own property. Women's friendship networks provided emotional support, practical assistance, and social connections. Female relatives, neighbors, and friends visited each other regularly, sharing news, advice, and companionship. These relationships were crucial to women's well-being and helped them navigate the challenges of life in a male-dominated society. Roman women found ways to express themselves and exercise agency despite formal restrictions. They influenced their husbands and sons, managed resources, created beautiful homes, raised children, practiced crafts and arts, maintained religious traditions, and built communities. They were not merely passive victims of patriarchy, but active participants in creating Roman civilization, even if their contributions were often unacknowledged or undervalued. When we imagine Roman daily life, we must include women not just as background figures, but as central actors. The mother rising at dawn to organize her household's day, the girl learning to weave beside her grandmother, the widow managing her late husband's business, the priestess tending the sacred fire, the slave woman serving her mistress, the worker woman selling produce at the market. All these women were vital parts of the Roman world. Understanding Roman women's lives enriches our appreciation of Roman society and reminds us that history belongs to everyone, not just the powerful men whose names dominate ancient texts. Women's daily actions, their labor, their choices, their relationships, and their resilience shaped Roman civilization as profoundly as any battle or law. Conclusion: the Eternal City's Eternal Lessons. As we reach the end of our extended journey through Roman daily life, we find ourselves enriched by a deeper understanding of how ordinary people lived in one of history's most influential civilizations. From dawn to dusk, from home to forum, from cradle to grave, we have walked alongside the Romans, observing their routines, understanding their values, and recognizing their humanity. The most profound lesson of this journey is that the Romans, despite living 2,000 years ago in very different material circumstances, were fundamentally people like us. They loved their children, worked to provide for their families, sought meaning in religion, enjoyed entertainment and social connection, took pride in their achievements, and faced their mortality with whatever courage or fear they could muster. The physical remains of Roman civilization, the ruins we can visit at Pompeii, Ostia, Rome itself, and hundreds of other sites, testify to their remarkable achievements in engineering, architecture, and urban planning. The aqueducts that still stand, the roads that still carry traffic, the buildings that still shelter people or inspire awe, all demonstrate the Romans' practical genius and their ambition to create enduring works. But beyond these physical monuments, the Romans left us something equally valuable: a model of civic life, a tradition of law and governance, a body of literature and thought, and countless innovations in technology and organization that continue to influence our world. When we use Latin-derived words, follow legal principles developed in Roman courts, admire architectural features invented by Roman engineers, or participate in democratic institutions inspired by Roman models, we connect directly to this ancient civilization. Yet we must also remember the darker aspects of Roman society. The slavery that underpinned their economy was a terrible moral wrong. The gladiatorial games that entertained them celebrated violence and death. The imperial conquests that spread Roman civilization also brought war, destruction, and suffering to conquered peoples. The inequality between rich and poor, the subordination of women, the harsh treatment of criminals, and many other aspects of Roman society should inspire not admiration, but critical reflection. This balanced view of Roman civilization, appreciating their achievements while acknowledging their failures, helps us think more clearly about our society. We too have impressive accomplishments and troubling injustices. We too will be judged by future generations for what we chose to prioritize, what we chose to tolerate, and what we chose to change. The daily life we have explored shows us that civilization is created not by heroes and leaders alone, but by millions of ordinary people performing countless small actions. The baker baking bread, the teacher instructing students, the parent comforting a child, the merchant conducting honest trade, the priest maintaining traditions, the worker building infrastructure. These mundane activities, repeated generation after generation, are what makes civilization possible and sustainable. As we leave the Roman world and return to our own time, we can carry forward several insights. First, that the past is not dead or irrelevant, but continues to shape our present in countless ways. Understanding history helps us understand ourselves and make better choices for the future. Second, that human beings across cultures and eras share fundamental needs, desires, and capacities. This recognition can foster empathy, connection, and humility, reminding us that we are part of a long human story that extends far beyond our individual lives. Third, that societies are human constructs, created by choices and capable of being changed. The Romans made choices about how to organize their cities, structure their families, conduct their commerce, practice their religion, and govern themselves. We too make such choices, and understanding how the Romans approached these questions can inform our own deliberations. Fourth, that material progress and moral progress do not always advance together. The Romans achieved remarkable technological and organizational sophistication while maintaining institutions like slavery that we now recognize as profoundly wrong. This realization should make us question whether our own technological achievements are matched by moral advancement. Finally, that the small moments of daily life, the ordinary interactions and routines that fill our days, are not trivial but fundamental. The Roman who shared a meal with his family, the woman who tended her household shrine, the child who played in the forum, the friend who visited the baths together. All these small human moments of connection, care, and community are what make life meaningful, then and now. As you go forward from this journey, perhaps you will notice Roman influences in your own daily life. When you turn on a tap and water flows, think of Roman aqueducts. When you walk on a paved road, remember Roman engineers. When you use words derived from Latin, recall that you speak with an ancient accent. When you participate in civic life, recognize that you engage with traditions that have Roman roots. More deeply, perhaps you will reflect on your own daily routines and recognize that they too are part of history in the making. Your ordinary actions, your work and rest, your relationships and rituals, your choices and values all contribute to the civilization that future generations will study and evaluate. We are all making history every day, just as those Romans did, building the world that will outlast us. The Roman city we have visited in imagination may be ruins now, its people long dead, its empire vanished. But the memory lives on, preserved in stone and scholarship, in language and law, in traditions and technologies. The Romans speak to us across the centuries, reminding us of our shared humanity, teaching us lessons from their successes and failures, and connecting us to the long chain of human civilization that extends from the distant past into an unknown future. Thank you for joining this calm, extended journey through ancient Roman daily life. May you carry forward a sense of connection to the past, an appreciation for the enduring patterns of human existence, a critical understanding of both achievement and injustice in history, and a recognition that your own life, however ordinary it may seem, is part of the great human story. The wheel of time turns on, connecting generation, past to present to future. The Romans had their day in the sun, as we have ours, as future generations will have theirs. What matters is how we live our time, what we build, what we cherish, what we pass on. In that sense, the most important history is not what we read about, but what we create through our daily choices and actions. Sleep well, wake well, live well. The eternal lessons of the eternal city await those willing to learn them. And somewhere in the ruins of Pompeii, in the stones of the Forum, in the preserved artifacts of daily life, the ancient Romans still whisper their stories to those who will listen. Farewell, and may your own daily life be rich with meaning, connection, and purpose, as the Romans hoped theirs would be.